Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode 101, and today we're going to be talking about finding a plan using data. But before we move on to that, I would like to thank my sponsors, ntgazone.com. This seminar is going to be an article that's slightly different than the presentation. It has some things that are different. It has a maybe slightly different spin, but it's a very good companion piece to this one. I would also like to thank my patrons. And I have two new patrons who joined in the recent days. Sam is one of them, and Wesley is the other one. So thank you very much for joining. But remember, there's space for more. I didn't limit the amount of people who can patron me, so please do. It does help me getting motivated to churn those seminars out. So thanks for that. And before we move on to the main topic, I'll start with the preamble. And the preamble this week is I've spent a lot of time thinking about Khans of Tarkir. I'm not a big fan of the format, but I do see merits of the format. And I do see merits of design as it was done in that particular set. I don't know exactly all the Boomer sets. I was not playing in that time. And the time that I was playing, I don't remember because it was so long ago that, it's hard to remember what happened in Odyssey block or something. But I was thinking about a format speed, and I was thinking about two aspects of the game that I often raise. One is being the draft skill, and the other one is being the play skill. And I came to the conclusion that format speed determines the ratio between how important those skills are. And I can imagine why some people are getting frustrated with the modern set design. Because modern set design, in my opinion, very much promotes good drafting skills. People who know what to draft, know all the cards, know how to navigate drafts are going to end up with really good decks. And those really good decks, because of how they play, they limit the amount of decisions you need to make in order to win the game. While sets like Khans of Tarkir are different. In there, drafting is, of course, important. You still need to get good cards. You still need to understand what are they. But those formats, you will frequently run out of cards. Decisions on how not to run out of cards are going to be more important. The games last longer, and because the games last longer, they will be burdened with more decisions that are important for the game. And this will promote players who are technically good players. And I think that this is a big difference between modern set design and this kind of design we see in Khans of Tarkir. Also, the decks are not going to be brimful of bangers. Decks are going to be full of filler cards, and knowing how to navigate drafts well while you have those filler cards, how to build decks, maybe even in Best of 3, how to sideboard, how to transformatively sideboard if you have piles of multiple colors, is going to be hugely beneficial for people who are good technical players. And I think that I'm going to talk about it later, but I think that there is space right now to design sets slightly differently. And one thing that I would be thinking about if I was designing the modern sets is how to make the cards still powerful as they are, but make the format slightly slower. And we're going to go deep into that topic because a lot of the seminar today is going to be about speed of the format, about what impacts the speed of the format, about how speed format determines what kind of plan you have with your decks and how to figure that one out. Okay. And before we move to the main topic still, there is the patron question of the week. And this one comes from Trezio, who is in the chat. Hi, Trezio. Thank you very much for the question. It was an interesting one. And I paraphrase the question, but it is, do tap 2 effects cannibalize themselves? So basically, is there a limit of having those 1/3s that tap 2 permanents to deal 1 damage, and then maybe the 3/5 that tap 2 things and something gets +2/+0 until end of turn? Is there a limit to those abilities? And well, to do it, I basically calculated the win rates of the decks depending on how many cards that have a tap payoff do they have inside of them. And there are 7 cards that have those tap effects in the format. I checked how many of those were in white-red decks only, because I focused on white-red not to have included data from decks that may be not on plan completely for those tap effects. And I saw that decks in white red that don't have any of those effects had a roughly 55% win rate, and then up until 3 it increases in small increments. It goes to 55.2, 55.6, 56.5 when you have 3 of those payoffs, and then there's a slight plateau at 56% with 4 and 5 payoffs, and then it drops with 6 payoffs. It drops to 54. And if you go further, it drops even lower. The problem with that was that the sample sizes were too small. I didn't include them because the small sample sizes I just don't trust enough. But there seems to be a drop-off, and there seems to be a drop-off that optimum will be around 3-4 of those payoffs. But I don't think that this is necessarily because of the payoffs cannibalizing themselves. I think it's more to do with the fact that payoffs are not good enablers for that particular ability, because all of those things, maybe except the 1000 Moon Smithy, which I counted in that calculation, but it's a rare, so there's not much of data from that particular card inside. But most other payoffs are not good enablers, so you don't want to tap your Adaptive Automaton for... No, it does not count Deep Root Pilgrimage until Cardboard Hijack. Because you cannot tap for this ability. It only happens when something becomes tapped, so it needs actually a source of something that will let it be tapped. I also didn't count vehicles which have tap 1 or something. I only use the cards that have some other effect. But Adaptive Automaton is not going to be a good enabler for that kind of ability, because it's just a 4-mana 3/3 creature. You don't want to tap it, you want to tap other things for it. Now, if you have too many of those, obviously you will have like 3 automatons on board and then nothing to tap for them except for themselves, which is going to be a small disaster probably. So what I did is and this is a very arbitrary situation here because it's hard to say what is going to be an enabler. But I selected a bunch of cards that I thought would be decent in enabling those kind of abilities. And I'm talking about equipment which are idle on the board, things that bring 2 bodies, things that bring 3 bodies, things that make treasures at some stage. All those kind of things I put into the list, and I checked if there is any link between number of those cards and the win rate. And there is. Don't focus on the outlier at 12 enablers at 59%. But if you look at the graph, if you have only 3 of those enablers, it's around 53.6% win rate. And it slowly increases. When you have 7, 8, 9, 10, it's around 56%. When it goes above 10, it's around 56.5, let's say 57 on average with that outlier at 12. So there is like a good linear growth on that. Now, of course, there are confounding factors when you look at things like this. One of them is that maybe those enablers are just generically good cards. So, of course, the more generically good cards you will have in your deck, the higher the win rate. So we can't exclude it. And they are probably more on the plan for what the deck wants to be doing. And that might be slightly confounding. But you should have a high number of the enablers if you're playing those top strategies. In white and red in general, you should have a high number of those enablers. And yeah, that covers the question of the week. Hopefully it was useful for you, Tracy. Now, first topic I'm going to talk about today is the evolution of this format, because I think that this is an interesting case of mass ignore of reality. I'm not going to say mass amnesia because it's not about forgetting. It's like mass blindness of what is going on in this format. Because we still are thinking LCI, and every time I hear any content on that, I can hear that, it's a Jeskai format. Jeskai color pairs are just much better than anything else. And, it was true in the first couple of weeks, but from week 2, even from week 3 onwards, the best deck in the format is actually RG Dinos. It has the highest win rate. It has most consistent win rate. It didn't change its win rate all through the season, while other decks dropped off after the most important cards from those decks have been plucked from the draft pots much earlier, and while people tried to position themselves in Jeskai color pairs. The method I looked at is I took 600,000 games from the public data set, and I divided them in 12 batches of 50,000 games. And this is under the assumption, because the problem with the data that is in time is that first couple of days of the format have way more games than any other game. But I made a generous assumption that we learn by repetition and not by time. So every 50,000 portion of games is going to be the same amount of learning. So that's the premise. I'm pretty sure this premise is not 100% correct, but I think it is not without its merit. So I use this method to analyze those things. So whenever you will see the graphs now, you will see batches from 1 to 12. Batch number 1 are the games that were played on the day 1 of the format and thereabouts. And then as we proceed to batch number 12, this is something like a week ago, I think, that the data set is finished. So it covers all the span from beginning of the format to 1 week ago. And yeah, this basically is to avoid those lopsided sample sizes, which might be a problem if you would look at time. You would get 120,000 games in day 1 and then 20,000 games in the last day or something like that. Right. So first of all, how did the format win rate progress across this time? And you can see that day 1, 57% win rate. 17 lands users are invested players. They follow the set reviews. They follow the early access streams. They maybe even participate in the early access streams. And because of that, they have an edge over the first days. But quickly, even in the second batch, we see the drop from 57 to 56%. This stays similar level for the first 200,000 games, so till the end of batch 4. Then we have a slight drop even further, around 55.7% win rate, 55.6% win rate, this kind of range for batches 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then we see an even further drop to around 55% in batches 9, 10, 11, and 12. Even in batch 10, we have like 54.5, which is relatively low win rate for 17 lens users, which can be format specific, but it also can mean that the 17 lens user base is expanding. And the more it's going to expand, the more people who are closer to the 50% win rate are going to be there, because the average win rate on Arena is 50%. So if you would have all the players that ever played a game in 17 lens, average would be 50%. And I think it would be quite interesting to analyze the data if that would be the case. Although my Excel would probably die trying to bite 6 million game data sets. But yeah, we see a decrease in the win rate across the format. It's a slight decrease, but it's a continuous erosion of the win rate percentages over time. And then what happens to particular colors? And here we have the Jeskai color pairs, because I thought that these ones are the most important, as we focus them on so much over the analyzing of the format time. All the podcasts were covering them quite a lot. And let's start maybe with the white-blue. The white-blue started at around 59.8% win rate, quite high. And it stayed at 59% win rate until batch 3. Then it started dropping. 58.6 in batch 4, 58.4 in batch 5, 58.3, 57.2, went back to 58, but then dropped to 55, 55.5, 56%. So the drop is around 3 percentage points of Azorius over time. And especially those last 4 batches, the win rate is much lower than in the first 4 batches. We have a drop from around 59 to around 50, 56%. And we see very similar trend with Izzet. It started at 60%, and then it stayed around 59 until batch 4. And then it started dropping towards 58, 57.5 in batch 7, 56.9 in batch 8. And then even further, it started dropping to as low as 55.4 in batch 10. There is a slight rebound at the end of it, 56, 56.8%, but it's still much lower than it was in the first 4 batches of that I analyzed. And last of the colors in the Jeskai color pairs, which is white-red. This one started at 58%, and it started dropping quite steadily till batch 5, down to 56%. Then there was like a blimp, 57, but then it went back to 56 and stays around this level. And even batches 10 and 12, it was around 55% win rate. What is important is that actually there is no massive difference between any of those color pairs in the last 4 batches. So they have relatively similar win rates. If you would look at all of those batches, with Boros being slightly behind, but not as much as it was in the first 4 batches. In the first 4 batches, it was evident that Boros is 2.5 percentage points below both Azorius and Izzet, and now it's not the case. There is maybe a percent, maybe 0.5% difference between those. So what we can see from that is that the power of Azorius and Izzet dropped significantly over time. Boros dropped by some, but not as much as the other 2 did. Now, other 2 colors pairs that I wanted to focus on are Selesnya and Gruul. And the interesting part about Gruul, it started at 56.9, which is whole 3 percentage points below what Azorius and Izzet started. But over time, it stayed roughly the same. There's been ups and downs. It went up to 57.5. It went as low as 55.9, but it stayed around that level of maybe 56.5. Last 2 batches, the 11 and 12, are 56.9, exactly the same as on the day 1. So there is no change in the win rate of Gruul all across the format. All of those changes can be easily attributed to variance. There is no trend. It's going steady across the format. So Gruul is the format that stayed the same. And if you look at it, over the last couple of batches, Gruul is actually the top archetype, the top color pair in terms of the win rate in best of 1. And Selesnya started higher than Gruul, actually, at 57.4, 57.2. But then it was slight of a roller coaster ride for that thing. It does oscillate around 55.5. There are some ups and downs. I wouldn't put too much worth on those as a trend. I think that this color pair is just maybe dependent on how many staggering growth or staggering sizes are open in the pod. But it stays around this 55.5, which doesn't look impressive, but it's not terribly different from what Izzet and all the Jeskai color pairs are doing. Okay. And the last 2 color pairs I'm going to... Oh, wait, no, I'm not. And the last 2 color pairs I'm going to look at it are not, because I decided not to put that graph because it was too boring. I focus on the 5 of those because I thought other ones did not show any kind of interesting trends. I was thinking about putting Dimir and Golgari, but they have just been all over the place, and because of the small sample sizes within those batches. Because you have to think that each batch has 50,000 games, but they will be from all kinds of archetypes. So the less played archetypes are going to be vastly underrepresented there. Second thing that I wanted to look is the difference in being on the play advantage. So in the first batch, 60% of the games on the play, 17 lens users won, and 54% of the games on the draw were won by the 17 lens users. So the difference of around 6 percentage points between being on the play and on the draw. And this dropped in both cases. So the win rate on the play dropped from 60% roughly to around 58% in the last 4 batches. And the win rate on the draw dropped from 54 to roughly 51.5% on the draw. But what is more important is that the difference on the advantage of being on the play and on the draw has increased over time. Ever so slightly, but it did increase. So right now it's closer to 6.5-7% than it is to 6, which means that despite format being with us for a bit of a time already, there has. I was actually when I did this analysis, I was expecting this gap to be smaller over time, but actually it did increase. It's harder to win on the draw now than it was in the week 1, probably because of the less of the disproportion between in knowledge between players, which means that people know that you need to start the game aggressively and you need to keep up with that and play those 1 drops, 2 drops, and stay in the game, because if you don't, you're going to be losing games. The next thing I'm going to look at is game duration, and this is how many turns does a game last. And small differences in game durations are actually quite important. So you see this graph, and on first days of the format, games were lasting around 9.1 turns, and then it dropped to 9.05 turns. Then it dropped to 9 turns, and then started to become a bit longer, around 9.03. But in thousands of games, these small differences are actually quite profound. So the format has become faster over time, by a certain margin. Which means that the more people know, the better they are in positioning themselves in a situation where the game is going to last longer. And I think that the LCI's overall on the play advantage is on the high end, and this is an advantage that because, for example, 1 was a format that was fast. It was very fast, but it didn't have a large on the play advantage, which meant, to me at least, that the speed of 1 was dictated not by the cards themselves, but by the disproportion in knowledge between players. It meant that some players were playing just bad decks that were easily overrun. While here, I don't think that this is the case, because the speed and the on the play advantage are tracking what I would expect from a set. There is a sort of intimate relation between speed of the format and the on the play advantage. And if 1 was an outlier there, because the on the play advantage was smaller than I would expect, this one is exactly where I would expect it. So I think that this is based on what cards are doing and how the format plays out. There is just an intrinsically big on the play advantage in this format. So I think an interesting thing is that in this particular format, the games that 17 Lands users won lasted longer on average, and by quite a lot. And that also that difference increased over time. So the games that 17 Lands players won became longer and longer as the time progressed, and the games that they lost became shorter and shorter as the format progressed. So we started at 9.5 turns for the won games and 8.6 turns for the lost games for the 17 Lands users. And at the end of it, we have 9.55 per turn, and around 8.5. So especially those lost games became shorter and shorter and shorter. And I don't know if this is an effect of an actual data or just people know better when they lose and they just concede a bit quicker, which is a possibility. Or is it just because the games are sort of like a grind? And this is not a relationship that happens in every format. I remember formats where actually the games that 17 Lands users player win are taking slightly less than the games that they lose. So it is a bit of a surprise for me. And I have no good explanations yet, but I think this is a metric that I will have to start exploring with a bit more scrutiny in the future, trying to figure out why some formats 17 Lands users overwhelm their opponents quickly and then they struggle in their losses for long, while in this one it's the opposite. I think that it might have something to do with snowbally kind of effect of the games, that when you lose, you just lose pretty badly. And 17 Lands users, being better players, are capable to flip some of those snowbally games, but it will take them a lot of time. And when they win, they still win quite fast. But a lot of those games that go 50-50 will go the side of 17 Lands users. And because of that, they will be longer. Okay. There is also game duration difference between being on the play and on the draw. It's very one-sided. Games that are on the play by the 17 Lands users are shorter by roughly 0.1 turns. So it's 9.07 in the first days on the play, 9.15 on the draw, and it changes more or less the same way as the average speed duration changes. Obviously, ends up with the 9 turns exactly on the play and 9.06 on the draw, roughly. So not a big change there between the values, but consistently games that the 17 lens user is on the play last a bit shorter. But again, I divided things into batches, but those batches are based on time. And you can see the time on this graph, how it changed the makeup of the data. Because, of course, in Magic, we do have seasons. And those seasons determine in which rank you are. And I thought this graph was an interesting addition to these analyses, just to give you a little bit of a think. That in the first days, 63% of the players were in gold or lower from the data sets, and only 36% of the players were in platinum or above. But the fraction of people in platinum or above increased throughout the season, and that might have impact on the data. That's something that needs to be taken into account. And it increased by quite a lot, because even in the second batch, it's already 47% of people in platinum above, 57 in batch 3, 61 in batch 4, 65 in batch 5, goes all the way up to 79% in batch 10. And then there was the end of the month. And here probably half of the data is from the end of the month and half of the data is from the beginning of the month, because in batch 11 we have 35% of the players in gold or lower and 65 in platinum or above. And in the last batch we have 61% of people in gold or lower and only 40% in platinum or above. So half of the platinum players between batches 10 and 12. But amazingly, you see that there is no massive difference between batch 10 and 12 in any of the metrics that we've shown. So I'm not super worried about those differences in the composition, because they are not related to the skill level of the players, but more they are related to format reset. Players stayed the same. They were just relegated to gold because they were in diamond or something. But worth to see that there are such big differences in how the ranks are distributed over time and how it changes throughout the 17 lens data. It might be important in some cases. I really like how this slow dilution of people in gold happens over time. There's a very good trend there. It's not linear, but there is a trend there. Okay. Now let's talk a bit about the metagame, because this is another topic that is not frequently touched upon, but draft does have a metagame. There are decks that are better against some decks than other decks. And more importantly, even, there are some decks that 17 lens players are doing better than average against. And hopefully I will be, by switching between slides, I'm going to be able to show some of that. But here we have a square. There are nice colors. There are some numbers inside of the squares. The numbers is a win rate. And the win rate is the 17 lens user's deck color pair and the opponent color pair. So for example, here we have 54, and this is a mirror matchup between Azorius decks. And in mirror matchups of Azorius decks, 17 lens users win 54% of those decks. But not in all mirror matchups, they win roughly the same. For example, is it mirror matchups? 17 lens users only get 3 percentage points advantage over the opponents. They win 52.9% of their games. Well, actually, when you calculate this, more like 6 percentage point difference. But for example, in Selesnya decks, it's a massive 56% win rate for the 17 lens user deck. It doesn't make sense, no? It should be relatively consistent, but that tells to me that, for example, 17 lens users build better Selesnya decks than the non-17 lens users, or at least their opponents. And the same goes for the Demir decks, when there is also a 55.7% win rate of the 17 lens users. This means that 17 lens users build much better Demir decks than their opponents do. But also what you can see in those graphs is when you look at each row, you will see more or less which archetypes 17 length users are good against in a particular when they are playing a particular archetype, and which not. So, for example, if you look at Azorius, it wins 62.7% against white-black, 62.2% against blue-black, 63% against black-black. So it just basically demolishes those slower decks. And same, 60% against black-red, 60% against blue-green. But, so it annihilates all those sort of tier 3 decks. And it has the most dominant performance against those tier 2-3 decks than any other combination in the hands of 17 lens users. But when you look at the win rate against white-red, for example, it's only 52.7. The win rate against other Azorius decks, 54, which is okay-ish. Is it only 50.3%? So it's basically a coin flip, which is a rare situation that 17 lens users playing the most dominant deck of the format, or at least one of the most dominant decks of the format, have such a low win rate against something that is not a mirror matchup. So Azorius decks don't do very well against blue-red, and only 54% against Gruul Dinos as well. So it is a sort of, you have those decks constructed, the kind of decks that do well with all those tier 3 decks, and they just smash them into smithereens and win with all of them, but are not very good against the best decks in the format. And because of that, they rarely win tournaments, because they might go through the first couple of rounds with a good record, but after a few rounds, they will start bumping into those tier 1 decks and start losing to them, and then they will end up somewhere in the midfield. And maybe occasionally someone will spike with those type of decks, but that's more or less about it. But when you look at the Izzet, which is another good archetype, you see that Izzet actually, in the hands of 17 lens users, wins 57% games against Azorius. And that probably explains why Azorius doesn't win that much against Izzet. It's just that Azorius is a pretty bad matchup against Izzet in general. So that's something for you to keep your mind on. On the other hand, and of course, it wins like 58% against the white-black, but that's not such a big difference between how much it wins against Azorius and how much it wins against white-black, which is a mediocre archetype the most. It only wins 55% against white-green. And that makes me think it just doesn't do very well when you start playing 3/3s and 4/4s. When you're playing Izzet. But smaller creatures that the white-blue presents to them, and maybe slightly slower game plan, that's exactly what blue-red is doing fantastically against. 52.7% against white-red, only 52 against Gruul, again, pointing me to that fact that the best strategy against Izzet decks is just play a couple of chunky creatures and clog the ground, because despite having sirens and a couple of other flyers, the deck does not do so amazingly well against a clogged ground, and maybe cannot cope with the reverse attacks when they start turning the corner. It does very well against all the other tier 3 decks. So white-black is a slightly outlier there with only 58.7. It wins 61% against Dimir, 61% against Simic, and around 59.5% against Ragnos and Golgari. So yeah, that's blue-red. Dinos, on the other hand, no spectacular numbers, but also no bad numbers. It has 57% win rate against white-black, 55% against white-red, 58% against white-green. That's where it does the best, and Ragdos maybe. But it has solid numbers everywhere, like solid. I mean, they are definitely above average everywhere. 53.6 against Azorius, 54.7 against Izzet, 55 against Dimir, 55 against Golgari, and then 53.5 in the mirror matchup. But of course, it's a mirror matchup. So, yeah. What other deck was interesting? I think that the interesting one was white-black. White-black has terrible numbers against Azorius and Izzet, 48% roughly there, 50% against red-green, but it has pretty decent numbers against Simic, Ragdos, Golgari, and Selesnya. It's around 56% there. So in some pods, if you play a pod draft, you might actually be not badly positioned if you play a white-black deck, if you know that maybe there's not so much Jeskai stuff circling around. And another interesting one, Boros, because that's one of the better decks. Good 56% almost against Azorius. Really good against all those tier 2 decks, so like 57-58% win rate against those tier 2 decks, but it does pretty poorly against Izzet, 54%, and against Gruul, 52%. So these are the weak spots, and 53% in the mirror. That's to be expected. And like things like Rakdos, they just do badly. 17 lens users didn't figure out how to play Rakdos. Golgari also not amazing. It does okay against Dinos, and this is actually interesting that Golgari decks have the highest win rate against Gruul decks in the hands of 17 lens users. Right, but then I thought, well, this is looking at 17 lens users, and these numbers can be confusing because, of course, average in this square is above 50%. It will be around 55%. So it's maybe hard to compute. So I decided to do a sort of like a flip around when I looked at the same thing, but I looked at both players. So as you can see, all the mirrors will be now at 50% because, of course, in the mirrors, someone has to win. It doesn't matter which player wins and which one doesn't. So you get this 50%. And here you, for example, see what I was talking about is that if you look at both players, Azorius doesn't cope very well with Izzet. It only has around 46.6% win rate against Izzet, so below average, and it also is below average against Boros. And this tells you more about the sort of average power level of the particular color combination. You see that Boros is a consistent deck. It wins with basically every archetype. It has a positive record, but by small numbers. So maximum of 55.7 against Simic, but most of the time around 53, 54. Except for Gruul, where it only wins 48% of the game, 49. Selesnya is consistently around 50%, which is nothing to be proud of. It does okay against Orzhov and Simic, but those decks are just not good. It does lose quite a lot to Azorius decks, and it does lose quite a lot to Izzet decks. Dimir, atrocious numbers against Izzet and Azorius. This deck just cannot handle those and loses quite a lot. And this was the same in the previous graph. It was, of course, higher numbers because we have higher average win rate, but 41% win rate against Izzet and Azorius is pretty bad, and Boros only 46 as well, so pretty bad. It does above average against all the tier 2 decks. Izzet, again, good against almost everything except for Boros, where it actually has a slightly losing record, and Gruul, where it has a slightly losing record. So if we take all the players, white-green does not do so much so well against Izzet, but that makes me think that the 17 lens players just make way better Selesnya decks, and I think that this is the reason for that. Selesnya decks need to be built correctly, and if you don't build them correctly, you're going to lose games. And the fact that 17 lens users win 56% of the mirror matchups is telling me quite a lot about the quality of the builds of non-17 lens users. And yeah, almost every deck loses against Gruul, although the numbers are not spectacular, but it's consistently good. It only loses to Azorius at 48.8. So yeah. Rakdos loses to everything. It only has 50% win rate in the mirror matchups where it has to have it. While actually Selesnya manages to win with Rakdos and Golgari decks. Also, Golgari is slightly disappointing in those numbers. It's roughly, at best, at 50%. it wins like 51% of the games against Rakdos, but Rakdos is just pretty bad. So yeah, there you go. Okay, now let's move outside. Let's move to the game duration data. And of course, the average speed of the format is one thing, but it doesn't tell us everything. Different color pairs will have different speeds. And there is actually a big gap. If you remember this evolution of the format speed, it moved between 9.1 turns and 9 turns on average as the speed of the format. So 0.1 turns difference between different batches that I analyzed. But when you look at the speed of Izzet decks, which are the fastest decks in the format, their average game lasts 8.2 turns, while Dimir, Golgari, and Orzhov 9.7. So 1.5 turns difference on the average game duration when 17 lens user is playing those different decks. And there is everything in between there. So the fastest deck except for Izzet is Boros at 8.6. Then there is Gruul at 8.8, Simic at 9, Selesnya 9.1, and then Rakdos and Azorius at 9.3. So then there's the big jump to 9.7 with Dimir, Golgari, and Orzhov. And of course, this doesn't tell us a whole story. Because we know that some decks want to be fast and some decks want to be slow. The question is, are those speeds sufficient for those decks to achieve what they want to achieve? So what I did is I looked at the win rate of each deck at depending on how long does the game last. So here we have a turn number when the game finished, and here we have a color combination. And here we have the win rate. And you can see that these have clear patterns. Like, for example, Izzet has a win rate of around 68% when the game finishes on turns 4, 5, and 6. Then it starts dropping off. If the game finishes at turn 9, Izzet only has 52% win rate. So that's a big steep drop off. At the turn 6, 68, turn 9, 52. And then it drops into deep 40%. So like a game lasting 11 to 16 turns, Izzet decks will have roughly 43 to 41% win rate, which is atrocious. That means to me that the plan of the Izzet decks is clearly to win as fast as possible. The deck has absolutely no late game. The wins late in the game will probably be when you get the opponent to like 4 life and maybe manage to squeeze in some kind of direct damage spell or one attack goes through. It's quite similar for Boros. It actually has almost same numbers. So around 68% if they win turns 4 to 6. Then it drops to 63, very much like Izzet. Then drops to 58 on turn 8, just like Izzet. And then drops to 53 on turn 9, just like Izzet. And then it sort of stays in 40s. But despite those curves looking very similar, those decks have different win rate. And that made me thinking, like, okay, why would they have this very different win rate if the profile of how they win the games and what are the win rates in different clusters of the games are so different? And of course, the answer is pretty obvious. Izzet just wins more games early. The more games with Izzet finish early. So I plotted those things and what percentage of the games for both decks end on which turn. And these curves look very similar, but not identical. You can see that, for example, on turn 6, there is 12% of the games that Boros plays that end on turn 6, but 14% of the games that Izzet plays that end on turn 6. So Boros is just much better in enforcing their plan of ending the game as quickly as possible. And, this means that that if I remember the numbers correctly, but it's from my head, I didn't have this particular graph, but roughly 54% of the games that Izzet plays will end before turn 8, but only 47% of the games that Boros plays will end before turn 8. And this small difference is exactly in the area where Izzet has a very high win rate. So, of course, those small differences in how many games end on those turns will mean that the win rate of Izzet as a color pair is going to be slightly better. Because, of course, it also means that more games that are in this crap bracket of their win rates is going to be happening in Boros and not Izzet. And then we have Azorius, which has a completely different profile. It still wins quite a lot in the early game, but it doesn't have an amazing win rate if the games end on turn 4, around 57.6. It's good, but not like amazing. Around 60% when the games end on turn 5. Remember, Izzet at the same time has 70%, so 10 percentage point difference is quite a lot. 61% on when the games end on turn 6. Again, 68 for Izzet. That's a big difference. But it stays 61% on turn 7, and then Izzet already drops to 63.8. 59.5 on turn 8, and that's first time when actually Azorius has a higher win rate. And it has higher win rate up till the end, because when Izzet drops down to mid 40% win rates and on turns 10 to 16, Azorius stays in mid 50 win rates. So Azorius is a deck that can be aggressive, but it's also having some staying power. And I think that this makes Azorius the only real mid-range deck in this format, where, the only successful mid-range deck in this format that has a potential of aggressive start, explosive start, but probably should focus on trying to make the game last a bit longer and not focusing on super quick kills, because it's just not very good at doing those super quick kills. The decks that are good in doing super quick kills are actually Boros. And this was a bit of a surprise to me, because I was thinking Boros, maybe a bit more grindy, maybe, it has all those tap to things to ping kind of things. You might want to prolong the games a bit and then do the last damage using those mechanisms. But actually, it does look to me like Boros does want to get super aggressive and win the game very quickly, like before turn 8. And it definitely does not show any kind of sign of longer staying power than the Izzet decks, with the mid 40% win rate between turns 11 and 16. And when you look at it, also it was reflected in the numbers. So if you remember that on turn 6, Boros was capable of finishing 14% of its games with a really high win rate of 68%. Azorius only 8.4% of the games end there. And actually, the peak for Azorius is on turn 8, while the peak for Izzet is on turn 7 in terms of most games finished. And then way more games for Azorius end up after turn 8. So there is a big difference between those. Again, I don't remember the numbers from the top of my head, but there is something like 15 percentage points difference in how many games end up before turn 8 in the favor of Izzet. So Azorius, despite being a Jeskai color pair, unlike the other two Jeskai color pairs, is not a super aggressive deck. Its plan is leaning towards maybe more control. It has some really good controlling tools. It has all those double-faced uncommons that are actually more common, that you can get access to more frequently in the draft, in Clay-Fired Bricks and Springblade Soul something, whatever, the DO5 artifact. And then there is the Mural, which is pretty good as a mid-range card rather than, or maybe even control card. There is another option, that there is a small fraction of super aggressive Azorius decks that are really good. But there is also a fraction of controlling Azorius decks that are really good. And because of that, the durations of the game are more spread out, because we're looking at one color pair, but two different styles of deck. But even if that's true, then the fraction of those super aggressive decks is relatively small. So keep that in mind. Gruul is actually another aggressive deck. It's not as super aggressive as Boros and Izzet in terms of how fast it can win, and in terms of how much it wins in those early finishing games. Because Gruul has a problem that sometimes it will be overrun, because if it has a bad 2-drop and the first play is realistically like a 4-drop, and then there is a Petrify waiting for that 4-drop, it can get run over. So the win rate in the first between turns 4 and 7 when the games end is around 60-62%. But then there is also a drop-off. So it doesn't have staying power very much like Izzet and Boros, and it's similar in this way. You would think that a deck playing 6-drop dinos is going to be good in the late game, but actually Gruul shows that it's not. And if you are playing Gruul, you probably should be thinking about, I want to make sure that my early game is top-notch, and then maybe the secondary thought is, oh, I can put some chunkers as a top end to maybe finish the last couple of damage. But if you don't have that early game, you're just not going to be doing enough damage in order for this deck to blossom. Arguably, it does have a slightly better end game than both Izzet and Boros. But maybe better is not the right word here. I think that the proper word here would be less worse. It has roughly 47%, 46% win rate in those late games, while Izzet had roughly 41, 42, even under 40 in some cases win rate in those later turns. And similar situation with Selesnya. It's just Selesnya is worse in the early game and has slightly more staying power for some reason. I don't know exactly what is the reason for that. It has around 49% win rate in those later games, and it has a roughly 59, 60% win rate in those earlier turns. So slightly worse in winning early and slightly better in staying in the game, or less worse in staying in the games longer. But of course, generally it has a lower win rate than Gruul, so Gruul is performing better. But those numbers for Gruul are enough to make it the highest win rate archetype. Keep in mind, this data does include early days. I probably should do it for last 2 weeks of the format and see if there is a big difference. What I would expect is that those numbers will go down. The numbers for early wins for Boros and Izzet, I'm pretty sure that at least some of those numbers are driven by those very explosive, super powerful decks that people drafted in the first couple of days. But I had to include all the data for this analysis to give sufficient sample sizing for everything, and that's what happened. Now, we talked about the aggressive decks, but not all decks in this format are aggressive. Notably, there are 2 decks that are really good late game in Golgari and Dimir. Golgari wins roughly 45% of its games that end before turn 7. But on turn 8, it becomes already 52. On turn 9, if the game ends, it becomes 56. And then it goes to this nice plateau of turns 10 to 13, where it's around 57%, 58% win rate for that deck, which is good. 58% for this deck is pretty decent. And then there's a slight drop off for the super long games, but these are based on small sample sizes, so keep that in mind. And Dimir, similar situation. It has 42% win rate in the games that end on turn 4, 5, 6, and 7, roughly, if you look at the average, which is not great. Turn 8, when the games end, still only 50%, but at turn 9, it's already 55%, turn 10, 58%, turn 11, 59, turn 12, 59, turn 13, 60% already, and then it stays around 58 for turns 14, 15, 16. So it actually has a good staying power. It wins a lot of games when it survives till the end. The problem is it just doesn't survive till that late frequently enough. So here we have the distribution of the games for Dimir and Golgari, and roughly similar. Golgari ends its games slightly earlier, but it's a very small difference between those two. There are some games, especially in that bracket between 9 and 12 turns, where Dimir has a slight advantage in how early how late those games finish. The problem is there's just too many games that end before turn 9 when Golgari starts having its advantage. You want this curve to be moved by 1 turn, and if the format would allow for that, Dimir would have probably around 56% win rate. If you would slow down all the games by one turn somehow, if you would design the set that would allow that, those slower decks would have 56, 57% win rate. They would be the top archetypes in the format. And some black would be very sad because he would have to draft aggro because it would be probably underdrafted. So this is the impact that those small differences in the speed of the format will have on what is playable and what is not playable. There are good control decks. It's just that they are not consistently enough surviving till the time that they need to become dominant in the format. And I think that this is a general issue with the design right now. And I think that looking at Khans of Tarkir, I definitely don't want people to print another Khans of Tarkir. I play that format, not a big fan. Too many of the cards that are just like absolutely atrocious. But there are some really good solutions from that set, and that's not making super busted 2-drops and 1-drops. Making a bit fewer of those is just going to make a lot towards control archetypes and slower archetypes to be more playable. We are complaining about Simic not being good, but Simic is usually playing those slower games. Also, Simic is usually playing those slower games, and it's designed at least to be playing those slower games, with green and blue notoriously having bad interaction for playing longer games. Blue's interaction is bounce, which is good if you want to finish the game quickly and bounce something and clean the path for attacking. But it's not great if you want to play like a 17-turn game, because you bounce something, they just replay it, and you just like lost a card and they lost some mana. But it's a long game, it's fine. They will find a spot to replay that card. So it's absolutely not beneficial for Simic decks if you design it like that. And also if you make it hard to survive, because even if they do survive, they still have that bad interaction. So that's potentially one of the reasons why Simic has been so bad in recent years. But even classically controlling archetypes like Dimir will have a problem because they just don't have enough tools to survive. Because also black has been given really bad creatures in the last sets. There's maybe like 2-3 good common creatures, but they are not aggressive, they are defensive, and there's not enough of them because they always try to make some aggressive black archetypes where you put creatures that are absolutely not on plan for the deck. Right. And here is the graph of all those distribution of the game lengths. You will see that decks that are capable of closing the fastest are Boros, Izzet, and Gruul. You can see that they have quite a lot of games that end on turn 6, 7, 8. Dominant value is around 7, 8 for those decks. The decks that are best in playing a longer game, especially Dimir, is here. So it tries to get that plan, and people try to implement that plan. It doesn't have tools to end games early. I mean, look, 6.9% of the games ending on turn 6, when Izzet at the same time has 14% of the games. And good, because they almost always lose in that time. So they managed to only have 7% of the games ending on turn 6 when they have around 40% win rate. But it's still not enough. This would have to move. This would have to drop to 2%. This would have to maybe be 6.9%. And this would have to be 11% in order for Dimir to be a deck with a high win rate in this particular format. So yeah, the format is still too fast for controlling decks to be able to win. They don't have tools to win early. They cannot play this mid-range strategy. They need to really go to ending the games on turn 12, which they are capable of doing, because you see 8% of their games end on that turn 12. And you still have a good, 12, 13% of the games that end beyond turn 12, which are, really good for Dimir decks with the 59, 50, 60% win rate at that stage. But it's just not enough games like this. It definitely needs to be trimmed. Sarawotabu, no, but this is the win rate based on the game duration. So we already talked about this earlier. Dimir decks, when the game lasts longer, win around 60% of the games. Yeah, this is the exact graph that looks at the game length in turns and the win rate, and this one looks at the number of games that end on a particular thing. So yeah, we discussed the win rates and game duration earlier, and now we're moving to why despite being actually a good late game deck, it's still not good enough for Dimir to become actually a good deck in this particular format. Right. Oh yeah, here we have those things side by side. So here you can see number or fraction of games that end on a particular turn and the win rates on a particular turn for those decks. And again, it moves in the right direction for the Dimir, but not enough. You have those weird curves when these two are too close. So how the games last, the differences between the duration of the games are too short, and the length of the game that benefits those controlling decks, they just require much longer games more frequently. And this format does not allow the mirror decks to go as long as they were planning. Right, last part of the seminar, we are going to look at all decks in the public datasets, and I focus on several color pairs, and we're going to look at cards in good decks. And the fact that something wins doesn't mean it's a good deck, but on average, it's going to be a better deck. So we're talking about decks with 5 or more wins, and we're going to look at cards in bad decks. And again, going 0-3 doesn't mean that the deck was bad. There is variance that happens, but in large data set, it's going to be worse decks with 3 or less wins. And I'm going to look at some differences. They are, again, going to be slightly small, but small differences in those huge data sets are meaningful. And not with every card we can probably draw like amazing conclusions, but we can look at cards that were overrepresented in bad decks and overrepresented in good decks, and maybe what does it mean for the particular color pair. So first, blue-white. And this is a big difference. There is, on average, 0.2 more of the Waterwind Scout in good Azorius decks than in the bad Azorius decks. This means this card is absolutely key for the archetype. And you can imagine why. It's like the top common. It not only means that there is more Waterwind Scouts, which is a good card on its own right, but it also means that maybe Azorius was slightly more open in those particular pods. So big difference. Another key card, Altic Cloud Guard, 0.13 more of those in good decks than in bad decks. And again, that means that there is 1 extra per 10 decks, which is not a lot, but it's still significant as a difference between such large sample sizes of decks. And 0.12 more Zoetic Glyphs. So Zoetic Glyphs, absolutely essential because this card is an uncommon. So having, 0.1 more of an uncommon is important. I see that the chat is laughing from the island, but that island is an important piece of data. It can mean several things. A, that better Azorius decks are slightly more blue, but I think that actually in this particular case, it means 2 things. Better Azorius decks don't splash and they don't play caves that much. And because of that, they have slightly more islands. So actually, the island is a card that is important in terms of how people build their decks and how they build their mana bases. It is. Other cards that we have here: Oaken Siren, Clay-Fired Bricks, Spyglass Siren, Staunch Crewmate. All those cards, roughly 0.1 of those. If you add those up, you get like one extra really good card in those good decks. And it's collection of bangers. I think that one card that is important, Petrify, is more frequently in those good. Sarawatabu, it is possible, but I did look at that and it didn't look like there is a difference in. So Sarawatabu says it also could mean bad decks play 16 lands more often. I did check it rudimentarily. I didn't put it in the analysis, and there was not a big enough difference in number of lands per deck to make that difference between those bad decks and the good decks. So it potentially could be, but I don't think it's the case in here. Petrify, I think, is an interesting card. It just shows again that it is a good card in this format, should be played, and is an important part of removal for those Azorius decks. Also, Inverted Iceberg, which may be not obvious that it's a good card in Azorius, but I told you this deck is a mid-range deck, not an aggressive deck, and because of that, all those things like Cladefire Bricks, Spring-Loaded Saw Blades, Tinkerer's Toad, Inverted Icebergs are pretty good. And of course, Cogburg Wrestler, but these cards have already much smaller difference in terms of the numbers. It's like 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. I don't know why the island is showing but not plains, but it might mean that you want your Azorius decks to slightly err on the side of being more heavy in blue if they are good, because that means you have more scouts. But I'm not sure. Importantly, cards that are not so great, Mountain, and I think that sort of 1-to-1 is almost 1-to-1 with the difference in islands, and that makes me think that people splash that red for something, and often that ends either that the color combination was not open enough to play a two-color deck and they had to splash, or something like that. But some cards that underperform, Cosmic Blast primarily. It's much fewer of those in good decks, and there's more of them in the bad decks. Glorifier of Suffering, just not on the plan of what the deck tries to do. Attentive Sunscribe, that's the 2/2 that taps to when it becomes tapped, you scribe. That card doesn't do very well. Envoy of Okinek Ahau. This is for me a symptomatic card of color was not that much open, and you have to play Envoy of Okinek Ahau, the 3/3 that makes 1/1s. Just not a great card. It's like 3/3 with upside is just not, doesn't cut the mustard right now. Important card, I think. Mischievous Pup, not doing very well, despite it probably being the best home, because you can bounce your spring-loaded Saw Blades, you can bounce your clay-fired bricks, and even with those, not doing that great. Out of Air, the counterspell, not doing great. Shipwreck Sentry, the 3/3 that can only attack when you played an artifact, not amazing. I think Envoy and Khans of Tarkir would have been a rare and probably still one of the better ones. I don't know, did I mispronounce it, Uncle? Okinek Ahau, no? Or the H is silent. Is it Okinek Ahau? Anyway, Compass Gnome also. I don't know. I know you well enough that I know there's always some sarcasm there. In terms of blue-red, we see similar cards. Waterwind Scout, Oaken Siren, Zoetic Glyph, but also Goblin Tomb Raider. We told already that this is the most aggressive deck. It wants to have the fastest clock, so the presence of Goblin Tomb Raider, Spyglass Siren, and Staunch Crewmate, and Cogburg Wrestler is not very surprising. Again, Island, and a Mountain, which probably means you don't want to play Taplands in this deck because it's a super fast deck and Taplands actively hurt you, and those decks that didn't put Taplands are having higher win rate. But we can check in the next graph if we see some of the caves. I actually don't remember. These were the first slides I made. I couldn't memorize all of them. Obviously, Captain Storm. The more Captain Storm, the better the deck. It's definitely on plan as the Signpost Uncommon. Etali's Favor actually is in this deck as an increaser of the win rate. Lodestone Needle, another thing that is beneficial for the deck because you want to be super fast. That's good tempo play. Geologic Appraiser is just good. Volatile Wonder Glyph, I am very much in favor of this card. It can give that a bit of staying power, maybe that one extra turn when you draw extra gas rather than running out of steam by discarding a land. It's pretty good. And still Inverted Iceberg to some extent. Which cards do we see in the lower bracket? Well, Plains. We have a Plains that fewer of those Plains you want to be playing. So that means don't splash in your Izzet decks. But we have the card that is the biggest underperformance is the Brazen Blade Master. The 2/3 that can attack as a 4/4 if you have multiple artifacts. Just seems like this is not the card you want to be playing in your Izzet decks. It's passable, but that's as much as can be said about it. Also, Shipwreck Sentry, not great. You really looks like you want to have those in the air power plus artifact synergies rather than having things that require artifacts to be actually playable, like Shipwreck Sentry. and Brazen Blade Master, because often you will not have enough of those things. Dowsing Device, not doing so great. Other cards, River Herald Scout, just too often becomes a 1/2 for 2 mana, which is not on your plan, unfortunately. Oh, Pirate Hat. I think that this one is worth mentioning. But again, these are much smaller differences, so don't put too much weight on it. It's good to know that these cards are not performing great. I think Rumbling Rockslide is a very good card to mention. It's the worst removal ever because for small creatures, it's too expensive. For big creatures, it will frequently be you will not have enough lands to play it, especially when you play Wanderglyphs as you should. And because of that, it's just a waste of space very often. It's much better to play a Loathsome Needle. I know it's a much better card, but it's more on brand. And you see that the 2 mana bounce spell is nowhere to be seen in the bad cards or in the good cards, which means it's somewhere in the middle, which means it's probably playable in those good decks. Boros, the most important card is Miner's Guidewing. Good decks had 0.2 more of those than the bad decks. Then we have Ultic Cloudguard, Etali's Favor. You want to start aggressively. I think that playing Etali's Favor on the Guidewing is just great. So yeah, getting this extra wider board by getting something out of your deck on the battlefield is great in this particular strategy. Boros, again, one of those most aggressive archetypes in the format, so it really wants to start early. Again, plains, play more plains, play more basic lands. That's the conclusion from the from looking at the decks that win and decks that don't win. Plains, mountain, but it still has Tinkerer's Toad. It still has Sunshot Militia, which was a bit surprising to me because these look like a more slightly more grindy cards, I guess. But potentially going wide is one of your strategies to deal those last points of damage. Plundering Pirate, Geological Appraiser, Cladefire Brick, Sanguine Evangelist, a rare, which is just showing how busted this card is in this particular deck. If you first pick Sanguine Evangelist, you should probably try to position yourselves in Boros, because that card is just sick in this particular archetype. What else do we have? Oh yeah, Anpo Aspirant, which actually was maybe as a bad card in some of the color combinations, but it's pretty good in Boros. The cards that don't do very well, Brazen Blade Master and Glorifier of Suffering. These 2/3 drops are particular offenders in being bad cards in those aggressive decks. You just don't want to sacrifice your board presence. Island, don't splash. Is it? It's for Jeskai decks. In this format, don't want to be Jeskai. They want to be 2-colored versions of them. Adaptive Gem Guard, which again means probably too slow, too easy to blank because it's just a big dumb beast and you don't have that much to make sure that it... I don't know why not. I don't know why not. I should have done extra checks on those, but I think that because it's a combination of the Hidden Volcano Courtyard and other factors, including playing too few lands. Other cards, Quicksand Whirlpool is just not good in this particular deck because you want to be aggressive. This card is good when you're on the defensive. That's pretty obvious. Dinotomaton. It's okay top end, probably better than the Adaptive Gem Guard, but still not good enough because maybe your threats are not big enough for the menace to matter. Envoy of Okinek Ahau. I would say that they're not decidedly not worth playing even as a one-off in the format. I say that maybe they should be maybe a one-off, and that's it. I think that part of it might be also playing the Splash Cave, the one that filters mana. And, this might be a combination of all those factors that will lead to those things. After the seminar, I might actually go to the Excel files and we try to solve that mystery with the chat in the post-seminar kind of thing. Another benefit of actually being here when it's being recorded live, you get bonus content. Right, that goes with the Boros. Yeah, Burning Sun Cavalry, that's not the 2-drop you want to be playing in this particular deck. Obviously, not enough dinosaurs. Red-green. So which are the most important cards? You will be surprised to see it's Quint, Firstborn of Gisha, is the most one that is overrepresented in those good decks, or high win rate decks. Then we have Forest and Mountain. No, it's not available on Patreon. I just no. Oh, maybe I should do that. Yeah, bonus content on Patreon might come soon. If Jake tells me that it's worth it. Forest and Mountain. Again, maybe meaning that you should play more decks in your dinosaur decks. Axejaw, by finding Axejaw, Armored Kinnicolor, Whatley's Final Strike, Poison Dyke Frog, Abrade. All of these are premier cards for the Dinos decks, and you want to have premier cards for the Dino decks if you play Dino decks. Abrade is at its best in Gruul decks because you want this early interaction, especially if you don't have a good 2-drop to play, which often will be the case because all your Dinos are expensive. Lorekeeper not there. I think Lorekeeper just Gruul usually just doesn't have enough dinosaurs to utilize the Lorekeeper well enough, and that's the truth of it. And the Lorekeeper later in the game just doesn't have as much utility as the Frog does. A Frog, so many games I won because Frog could block that 1-key flyer, because Frog could trade with that 1-key flyer, or because Frog could stop a big thing on the opponent's side with the Death Touch from attacking for many turns, and then I just can dominate the game later. Important part, you see the Pugnacious Hammerskull and Palani's Hatcher on the list. Again, not so many rares on those lists, so just how important are those things? And then Belligerent Yearling, Triumphant Chomp, Geological Appraiser, Trashing Brontodon, Cenote Scout. None of those 6-drop spells are on the list. You end the curve on turn on 4 mana really here, except for Palani Hatcher, but that card is just busted. So yeah, whatever. But most of the cards that are on the list are actually 1, 2, maybe 3 drops. So these are the cards that are super important. In terms of the cards that are overrepresented in the bad Gruul decks, Idol of the Deep King is the #1 offender. Why? Because this card is just a 3-mana shock in those decks most of the time. You don't have anything to craft with in so many situations. So it becomes pretty bad in that situation. Malamet Brawler, that's again, I didn't get the right 2-drops and I'm trying to play 2-drops and it's going to end bad. Basking Capybara, same situation here. Plains, again, don't splash. Swamp, don't splash. Captivating Cave, probably tried to splash. Not good. And don't get me wrong, there will be decks where splashing is good. And I had some great Gruul decks with great junk decks with Gruul base and some reanimation spells from Black that were absolutely busted. But I think people splash more frequently than they should be doing, and that's what we see in the data. Again, you should not interpret this data as, I should never splash. You should probably interpret it as that splashing is not something I should be doing as a default, but more as an exception when the circumstances are particularly good. And then bunch of minor playables, including that's one I think card that is slightly overrepresented in those bad decks. Diamond Pickaxe. You just usually don't have anything to put it on early, and once you have something to put it on, you'd rather spend mana that you have by that time to play a chonker, a 4/3 that draws your land or becomes a 5/4. This kind of thing. So there's just no good space on the mana curve for Diamond Pickaxe to be equipped in this particular deck. While in anything that has blue, Diamond Pickaxe becomes pretty good because you can have Zoetic Glyph, for example. And last one, Black-Green. And this just to show you that this data is so chaotic. And I think that it's mainly because Black-Green, few people know how to build those decks good or well. It's absolute chaos. Look at this data all you want, but the differences between how many of each card is in a good deck and in a bad deck is just super, super small. 0.05. This is like something something at the bottom of the cards in Gruul, and something at the bottom of the cards in white red on my list. So this data is not significant at all. So you can read the cards, but it doesn't mean anything. Oh, there is a bit more Death Cap marionettes in good decks than in the bad decks. What I decided to do with it is I tried to maybe go more specific, and I ramped up good decks to only trophy decks, and I lowered the threshold for bad decks to only decks that go 0-3 and 1-3. And I got slightly bigger numbers, but I'm still not trusting them that much. I can see Armored Kincaller a bit more in the good decks. I see Poison Dart Frog, Tendril of the Myco Tyrant, Tithing Blade. Here I do see Hidden Nursery, so we see some of the caves maybe. But again, this is a very small signal, so I wouldn't put too much worth into it. And I put those slides. I was thinking about it for some time. I'm not going to do all the archetypes. I'm only going to do few. And I thought maybe I should leave it out, but I thought it's important to show you that not every result is going to be a positive result. So it's good to say, look, there's nothing in this data. And I think that in this data, you can look all you want, but there is not much. One thing that I might see that, unlike in the previous archetypes, here we have fewer forests and swamps in the good decks, which makes me think that this is probably a cave signal. You want to be playing more caves in those Golgari decks. And I've had some good results with Golgari decks, and mainly around Defossilize also, so which is more in the bad decks. There are homes for those decks. It's just that they need to be done specifically. Weirdly, Preacher of the Schism more in the Golgari decks, probably because people open it and try to force it. Akawali, slightly more of it in the bad decks, because probably people try to make it work and the card just not that great. And the Black-Green Dinos deck is real. I had a couple of those. Most of them had also Palani Hatcher. Palani Hatcher, because it's easy to splash in black-green and it's busted. And that's how I ended up in those decks. I started drafting something, and then black was open or something, and then I saw green was open. I went on the green bandwagon and opened the Palani Hatcher, and all of a sudden I have some sort of dinosaur Golgari that can reanimate Palani Hatcher a couple of times. And trust me, reanimating Palani Hatcher a couple of times usually does the deal. Oh, and the last one that I have is white-black, because I was always also curious about this, how this deck works. Cards that are more predominant: Cloud Guard, Guidewing, same two as we saw in the Azorius, because actually white-black is probably similar to Azorius, more similar to Azorius than it is to Azorius is to Izzet and Boros. It's sort of mid-rangey, too control-y deck. It likes the Deep Cavern Bat, Clay-Fired Bricks, Chupacabra Echo, Fanatical Offering, Spring-Loaded Soulblades. All those cards are going to be good in the sort of grindy, attrition-y deck that doesn't plan to end the games quickly, but has some kind of evasive power. And then Tiding Blades and things like Chupacabra Echo will and Spring-Loaded Soulblades will let you stop the offensive from the opponent and stop them killing you so efficiently, because you're attacking at a different level than they are. You're attacking in the air. If they attack on the ground, you can attack. They attack you back. You have spring-loaded Soulblades that are great, which later can turn into a big blocker that will stop them from attacking on the ground, while you still have your Miner's Guidewing and your Deep Cavern Bats pinging for one over several turns, gaining you maybe some life and making sure that you can win the game. And because of that kind of small game that you're playing there, Hidden Necropolis and Courtyard both are overrepresented in those better versions of the deck, because that gives you a sort of extra spell later in the game, which can be useful. Sanguine Evangelist is busted. Preacher of the Schism is busted. Royal Necrobat and Tinkerer's Toad are just very well on the plan for this particular deck. What it has fewer of: Bloodrage Mycoid, Acolyte of Alka-Seltzer, Deep Goblin Skulltaker, Glorifier of Suffering, Vito's Inquisitor. All those cards are in the same category of things that require you to sacrifice something for very little value. In case of Goblin Skull Taker, it may be slightly better. You don't have to sacrifice; it can happen naturally. But the card is just so bad that you don't want to be playing it. Interestingly, Echo of Dusk is on the list here, but it probably has to do with you don't want to be actively sacrificing thing, and therefore activating Echo of Dusk is not going to be natural. You see that the Marionette is not in the cards that are overrepresented in the good deck, so maybe you won't have that many of those. And because of that, you don't have a good chance of getting descended reliably early. Another weird thing is the Iron Paw Aspirant that is slightly underrepresented. Again, this can be, the fringe of variance, but you would think that with all those 1/1 flyers that are good, Aspirant is going to be making them slightly better. But maybe the 1/2 body that it leaves behind is just not good enough for what you're trying to do. All right. We did it. We did it. So I would like to thank 17 Lands team. Misspelled fake Jake Brown. I took another time the bloody presentation with misspelled fake Jake Brown. Add the E at the end of it. My guardian spirit in terms of organizing it into a podcast. So I'm super grateful for him. Obviously, thanks to mtgazone.com. As I mentioned, a modified version of this is going to be released as an article, hopefully tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It's been written, it's been submitted, it's done. It's more about design. It's more about the plans itself than this one, because this one had a couple of other topics on top of it. So give it a check. Thanks to my patrons, especially to Reeds, Sam, and Wesley, the new patrons from this week. It's really, really important for me to get that extra. I have to somehow motivate the fact that I'm using so much time to try to analyze this data. It doesn't come easy. It takes like roughly 6 to 8 hours to make a seminar, and I need some sort of explanation why I do it. If not for myself, just to my wife. So it's great if you can support the stream and this podcast in some way. That might include becoming a patron. Don't worry, you get some perks. They're quite useful. You can ask the patron question of the week. You have access to the slides. So there are reasons to be my patron, and I would highly encourage you to become one, because in the end, it's nice to have data being analyzed. And I'm not the only one person that can analyze data in Magic. I just seem to be the only one that has enough masochistic tendencies to do so. So keeping me motivated is beneficial to the community in a way, because it's not enough to have data. Data needs to be analyzed, and I try to do it pretty rigorously whenever I can. And with that, I'm going to see you somewhere next week. I don't know, it's Christmas time, so probably not going to stream on the Christmas Eve. I might do a birthday stream. My birthday's coming up in a couple of days. We might... Jake, maybe we can do like a shared stream on our birthdays, so we can celebrate it together. I can have you, and we can do some episode like for the laughs a bit, but also with some data. Would you be up for that? Come on, you can do it. Because me and Jake sort of share a birthday-ish. Well, we sharing or bordering on our birthdays? So yeah, that would be great. It would be smashing. So maybe in 3 days we're gonna make something. Yeah, on the 21st. So yeah, if we do it in the right time, then we can, at least in my time zone, we can celebrate the split of the days. And with that, I'll see you next week.